it's a very particularly Christian conviction that each of us individuals as Christians, and even really as human beings, is individually and personally known, loved, created, called by God, with an intensely personal relationship, not just kind of a generic, overarching, universal sense, but really with that sense of being particularly created. This came to mind for me as I was looking at the this Sunday's gospel, the parable in the of the landowner who goes to the market to collect people to work in the field, at several times during the day, and then they all receive the same payment at the end. It's really only obliquely related, but it came to mind really because it's very much about this idea of being called individually and chosen, brought into this kind of context of working in the field, really something very much about vocations. And I think it's a good thing to reflect upon, because I know that many people struggle with this sense of really what it means to have a vocation. In particular, people will sometimes look at the intensely personal nature of a priestly or a religious vocation as this really beautiful way of kind of having that call come from God, who knows and loves us personally, and who calls us to some particular thing. But many people really don't have that kind of personal, clear sense of, what is it that God is calling me individually to do with my whole life, right? And in many ways, it's a great gift that so many priests and religious have had, that kind of intensely personal sense of being called to that particular way of life. But at the same time, and I think this is where many people perhaps might kind of misunderstand the reality of a vocation at times. At the same time, a vocation is not, most importantly, the lifelong trajectory. I think we see kind of a reflection of this too in the fact that certain people in the parable today are called at different times of the day, but then receive the same reward at the end, right? It's not as much about the lifelong trajectory. What is the fundamental nature of a vocation then? Every vocation at its root is an invitation by God to love him in return in some particular way. And we can see this again very clearly in priests and religious, in that kind of religious vocation that many people think of when they speak of a vocation. We also see it too in a sense in marriage, right? A man and a woman are usually, through the romantic relationship, feel called into entering into this lifelong union with each other, where they both promise to lay down their entire lives, their preferences, all of their personal and selfish desires, in the interest of the other, and to make themselves, in a sense, that this kind of lifelong servant to the other, to love that person and serve them as long as they both shall live. And then especially, of course, with children who might come along, to love and serve those children in after the pattern of God the Father. So, in those contexts, it's very easy to understand how a vocation might be this call to love God in return. But then what about those people? And again, I know there are many of them who have this sense that somehow they just missed the vocation's fare, almost. Like they showed up, they asked God, okay, what would you like me to do? And then feel like they heard nothing in return. And of course, they might look at that in those cases at priests and religious and married people who have this kind of very clear sense of the lifelong pattern, and then feel almost a little bit left out, as though somehow this God who created and loved me into existence and who loves me very personally somehow just kind of forgot about me personally and didn't actually call me to anything. That's nothing could be further from the truth. And we kind of know this intellectually as Christians, but then how do we figure that out in our day-to-day lives? Look, for example, though, at this idea of the lifelong vocation. Take say, a priest, someone who hears a call from God, enters the seminary, goes through formation, spends his whole life in a parish or in whatever ministry God has called him to, or his bishop more particularly has called him to, and then dies. Through that whole course, every single day of that vocation, the individual in question, the seminarian and the priest in question, has had to make a decision. Will I live this day, will I live this moment for God or for myself? It is entirely possible for someone to go through even a religious vocation and spend very little effort really actually working in the vineyard, in the field. And the same is true for each of us. Even if we don't have a particular sense of our lifelong trajectory, of our vocation in life, even if we don't have that kind of that sense of the distant scene and the ultimate kind of calling, how much I will love God, 20, 30, 40 years down the road, when my vocation has really kind of taken shape. The question that we should really ask ourselves when we find ourselves missing the distant scene is, what is the next step? What is it that God has given me to do? Who is it that God has given me to love today, here and now? Because every vocation, again, most fundamentally, is a call to love God in some form or another. And even if we lack the sense of clarity, the lifelong distant scene, which ultimately even priests and religious lack, we enter this life not knowing where it will take us, really. But we enter this life, again, without that clear sense. But ultimately, a vocation is measured based on whether or not that daily decision to love God has been made. And so I think for those who struggle with what their vocation might be in this sense, what exactly it is that God might be calling them to do with their life when they've tried so many different avenues and nothing seems to work, it is good to go back and to take encouragement in the fact that we can always go back to those two fundamental questions, which ultimately really are what every vocation revolves around. How is it that I love God with all of my heart, all of my mind, all of my soul, all of my strength this day in my circumstances right now? And then how do I love my neighbor as myself, following the pattern of Christ, who gave up his life for each of us?